Hi everybody and welcome to Mike's Hidden History. Today I want to tell you a story that's of a murder of a very young beautiful girl over 200 years ago, and her name was Ellen Hanley. And here I am overlooking the Shannon, the longest river in Ireland, in County Clare, in the cemetery, Boran Cemetery, near Collimer, the village of Collimer. And this is a tragic story that's still known to this day. And it's the story known as the Colleen Bawn, famous in musicals, plays and books. Now, the Colleen Bawn was Ellen Hanley, and she lived in Ballyvahan, and her mother died when she was 6 years of age. So she moved in with her uncle, and he reared her and he doted upon her. And she was, by all accounts, a beautiful, a strikingly beautiful young woman, vivacious, friendly and kind. And at 15 years of age, she came to the attention of one of the local ascendancy, John Scanlon. And he had come back from the Royal Marines. He was a lieutenant in the Royal Marines. And he was a man that was a heavy gambler, a heavy drinker, and was a young man who was noted for getting what he wanted. And he wanted Ellen for himself. Now, despite her being a commoner and he being a member of the ascendancy class, he knew that would be frowned upon by his family. So with his manservant and close friend, Stephen Sullivan, they hatched a plan. And out hunting one day, it was raining, and they asked for shelter in Ellen's uncle's house, knowing that Ellen was there. And this was the start of a secret liaison. She was infatuated by him. He wanted her because of her beauty. She wouldn't have anything to do with him unless she was married. He arranged that, and on the 29th of June 1819, they eloped together. They went to Limerick or Kilrush, and what is believed to be an impostor clergyman arranged the sham wedding, enough to convince Ellen that she was now married. So John put her in a house, rented a house in Glynn on the banks of the River Shannon, and hired another woman, Ellen Walsh, to be her maid servant and friend in the house with her. Now, this lasted for only less than 3 weeks, and Scanlon became fed up of Ellen and the arrangement they had. So with his manservant, Sullivan, they decided that they would have her killed. So the plan was that Sullivan would take her out onto the middle of the Shannon on a boat trip, because he also had a boat, which he did on the 14th of July 1819. He brought a musket with him. The first time he went, he couldn't do it, so he came back in. This time his master, John Scanlon, plied him with whiskey and gave them Dutch courage. He went out the second time, convinced Ellen to come with him, went out, beat her, and then shot her with the musket. He stripped her of her clothes, tied a rock around her waist with a rope that he had borrowed, and threw her overboard, thinking that was the end of it. Nobody knew where she went. There were searches. Nobody could find her. Now, after her disappearance and a number of weeks of looking for the missing Colleen Bawn, Ellen Walsh, her former maidservant, became suspicious when she saw her cloak being passed around between two women. She went to the Knight of Glynn, who was the local magistrate, to tell him of her suspicions. And while she was there, in fact, two policemen arrived at the door saying that a body had been washed up at Money Point, which is here where behind me here, where those chimneys are. And it was the body of a young woman, a naked, decomposed body. So the Knight of Glynn asked Ellen to come with him. She identified the body as that of her mistress. Now, the boatman that brought him to the place where the body was found, his name was John King, and he also identified the rope that was tied around the body as being the rope he had lent to Sullivan, or he'd loaned Sullivan some days previously, because it had distinctive knots which he had made on that rope. The two culprits disappeared. They couldn't be found. But in November the 19th, John Scanlon was found by police officers in outhouses in his parents' property in Ballypahan. He was arrested, uh, and the family hired the best barrister they could find of that day, Daniel O'Connell, the famous liberator, a well-known political figure and an outstanding barrister. So his trial was on the 11th of March 1820. People were not expecting a death sentence in a case where a member of the ascendancy murdered a commoner. But in fact, that was the case. John Scanlon was found guilty on the 11th of March. And on the 16th of March, he was taken to the place of execution called Gallows Green here on the clear side of the River Shannon. And to the very end, before he was hanged, he protested his innocence. Now, what happened to his co-accused, Sullivan? Well, he was found some months later in a jail in Tralee in County Kerry, where he had been incarcerated for passing dud banknotes. He was taken back to Limerick and he was tried. He was found guilty. And on the 25th of July, 1820, he was executed, hanged for the death of Ellen Hanley, the Colleen Bawn. But before the execution was carried out, he did confess that he actually did the deed at the behest and at the planning of his master, John Scanlon. Now, the body was taken here to this graveyard here on the banks of the Shannon, and it in Boran Cemetery, and through the charity of a local schoolmaster, Peter O'Connell, who had bought a grave site here. She was buried here on this exact spot here. This is the grave of the Colleen Bawn. And some years later, when Peter himself died, he's also interred in this grave with her. Now, the Colleen Bawn was famous throughout history. There are lots of articles, some books printed about him. The first book, actually, in 1829, by a man called Gerald Griffin, loosely based on this story. It was very, very popular. It was called The Collegians. In 1860, in fact, a play, a very well-known play, The Colleen Bawn, was launched in both New York and opened in London as well. And Queen Victoria, in fact, went to that 3 times. There's also an opera called, loosely based on this story, called The Lily of Killarney. There were other books and more recent books, a number of silent films made about the Colleen Bawn. There's the story of a young, beautiful woman who came to a very sad end at the hands of 2 ruthless neighbours, John Scanlon and Stephen Sullivan. Colleen Bawn, Ellen Hanley, her story over 200 years later. I'm glad to bring you that today. That's all from Mike's Hidden Histories. More next time.